Welcome to the place of rest, where our aim is to give you language that helps you displace the growing confusion, chaos, and dis-ease of our times. My name is Jonathan Boyce, and it's my pleasure to bring to you the first episode of a 4-part mini-series with former guest Steve Rees. Virginia invited Steve back to discuss the history of how he came to discover, learn, and use healing frequencies through music. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation.
Thank you for joining me today, Steve. I can't imagine a better person to discuss how we can step into a place of rest in such a time as this.
Yeah, we're in pretty crazy times.
Yeah. For those of you that are joining us, Steve is a hemodialysis RN nurse for over 30 years. So he's been in the medical field for a very long time.
Yeah.
So we've been blindsided by a lot of crazy information.
Oh, my. I have tried not to become cynical, but it's really hard because things have changed so drastically.
Yeah, because I want everyone to have context for this conversation that we're going to be having for 2 or 3 episodes.
Right.
So they understand why this is a big deal, that I'm able to discuss rest in the context of your professional background and where it led you.
Yeah. Well, do you want to start at the beginning?
Start at the beginning.
Well, it's amazing because...
Well, you're a nurse for 30 years.
I'm a nurse,
How did you get into the field?
How did I get into the field? Because my little sister did. I was out. Shirley and I had gotten married, and my sister is only 11 months younger than me, and she went straight into nursing. I was still floundering around trying to figure what I was going to do, and I saw her making good money. But at the same time, I've always had that compassionate heart, and so I put 2 and 2 together, and it just seemed to fit. So that's where I went. And actually, I had so much college credits already. 18 months later, I was an RN. So
you're a professional student.
Yeah.
What changes have you seen that have transpired? Because you talk about the topic that is central to the heart of rest, is displacing confusion, chaos, and disease. Because if we don't displace confusion, chaos, and disease, we can't have any peace. There's no peace, there's no rest.
Yeah.
So let's start with your field. What have you seen in the field of medicine? What's changed? What's happening?
Well, in the field of medicine, somewhat comically, maybe not comical, I started calling myself a drug pusher because the focus of medicine was more and more on what medication, what pharmaceutical to push in to get the desired results, rather than looking at what's the cause, what's bringing about the symptom. And so I just really saw a big switch there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's one of my friends is an RN, longtime friend. And one day she called me distressed, and she said people used to walk in with 2-3 meds. Now they walk in with bags of medicines that they're on, and their entire body is in a state of confusion, chaos, and disease. If they were sick before, now we have all kinds of...
And you have the side effects affecting the side effects, and it's just a scramble. And the other thing I have seen happen in medicine that is disturbing even now as I speak is that instead of focusing on the person, we now are focusing on the profit center. So it's become much more of a business model than it has a person model. And
the bureaucracy trickles all the way down.
Yeah.
Just my colleagues and the distress that we had at the clinic. I served at the clinic for almost 8.5 years, and I saw how labor intensive it was to comply with
your standards of care.
That were diminishing our capacity to serve well and do our job.
Well, and to take the creative thought out of it, because no longer could you take a look at a situation and go like, well, let's try this. I think this, considering all the pieces of information, let's try this. Well, now it's like flip over to the book. Here's our standard of care. This is what we'll do. And so it becomes so rote and so absent of creativity.
It's interesting that you should say that, because I often thought we're losing the heart that is imperative and necessary to facilitate healing.
Right.
And the life of the heart is in the blood.
Right.
And you're a blood specialist.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, my last 20 years of my experience as an RN was at hemodialysis. So for those of you who don't understand that term, that's somebody who has kidney failure. And so then we put them onto a machine that pulls the blood out, runs it through a filter, and then gives it back clean. And that's important because that normally is performed by the kidneys and liver. And when those things fail, then that person will die. And so in order to keep them alive, then we filter that out, and that keeps them alive. So that brings us to the idea that blood is the whole center of life. If we don't have the blood operating properly, then life doesn't take place. Life ends.
The blood is instrumental. The life
is in the blood.
The life is in the blood. It explains why when you go to the doctors, they take your temperature, they take your blood pressure, and then they always
take labs.
Labs.
Yeah. You know, that's one of the first things you do when somebody comes into the emergency room is, CBC, hemoglobin, chem panel, boom. It's that way we have a little read on what's going in the body because the blood carries all that. So
we go through great pains to help people understand that when they are dealing with cancer, autoimmune disease, or any other disease state, that there is an emotional, spiritual, and there's just a psychological component, psych being the soul, the anatomy of the soul, the mind, the heart, the will, the conscience, the feelings of a person. And you can't separate the spiritual, emotional from the physical manifestation of disease states. And I often say what the heart won't release, the soul can't reconcile, but the brain will develop workarounds so that the body can digest the weight and the toxins from all of that. So by the time we're dealing with something like cancer, for example, or autoimmune diseases, in some ways, it tells us exactly what to start asking and where to go to help unwrap the anatomy of that disease state. Can you expound on that based on people you've served, observations you've made, the clinical stuff we can all go read, and frankly,
it's fascinating. In all of the years that I was at the bedside, I could see somebody who had all the reasons physiologically that they should be fine, but their mind wasn't fine. And so their body was following their mind. When I was training,
their disease didn't make sense.
Right, exactly.
But it
what's wrong?
Exactly.
How come they're not getting out of bed? What's going on here? And it always came down to what was their thought process. That was what was controlling everything.
Yeah.
They had everything else was in order, but the thought process wasn't in order.
As a man thinks in his heart, so he is.
Yeah. Yeah,
right.
hung by the words of our mouth.
Exactly. And all of a sudden, those ancient documents that we're quick to dismiss and say
there's wisdom.
They are irrelevant now.
Right.
That we're beyond those things. All of a sudden, we find these ancient truths.
Maybe we shouldn't have thrown them out after all.
Maybe we shouldn't have thrown them out after all, which is exactly where we're going to head with our discussion.
Yeah.
But that's incredible. What did you do? How did you navigate? Because you're 3.5 hours with these people in a room. By the way, multiple times a week, right?
Right. Usually 3 times a week. Yeah. That kind of brings me to the harp.
But were there other observations you made? In 30 years, you've observed systems, you've observed people, you observed families, you observed colleagues.
Yeah.
Discuss those things in the context of measures of the dis-ease that emerged in the time.
So,
30 years is a long time.
And that takes me back. So here I am, I'm in the room for 3+ hours. And the nurse taking care of the patient might see them once or twice because the patient care loads are increasing more and more. The doctor might flash in for 20 seconds.
And that's ironic because everybody waits for the doctor to come in, right? Yeah.
So they would, spew off this paragraph and then walk out the room. And so then the patient family would turn to me and go like, what did they just say? Could you explain that to me? And that was the one thing I really enjoyed about what I was doing with hemodialysis, because I was able to treat one patient at a time and have that much time so that I could use that for education, explaining all of that, which is why I stayed in the hemodialysis, because I saw the pressures that were being applied on the other side of things, on the basic floor nursing and the doctors. I have a friend that's a doctor, and he has to see so many patients a day just to break even for what he's paying for his office space.
And insurance.
And insurance and, all of the costs. And so it starts to become piecemeal factory slam. And so that's one of the reasons I stayed in doing hemodialysis, because I felt like I was at least being able to be one of the voices that could slow things down. So we're getting back to R.E.S.T. because...
By the way, if I could interject a thought, making it impossible for the doctor and his staff to understand the constituents of this person, spiritual, emotional, physical constitution of what's happening. And in seconds, literally, if you're lucky, you get 5 minutes of that time. It's impossible to help a person heal.
Yeah, if you do an intake physical, history and physical is what we call it, where the doctor normally takes a patient in. Most of them have become so cursory because they only have how many minutes to do this before they get on to the next one. Whereas you really don't know the history. You really don't know the other factors that are impinging on what you're seeing in front of you.
If the patient does not take their history personally into account, and I'm saying this for the benefit of our listening audience, if they don't take their personal history, and not just the story that began in their home, but the one that began in the home of the parents, and their early childhood developmental experience into account and reason them in context of the disease state that they find themselves in, I think it's very, very difficult to heal and stay well. Yeah, it is. And it's one of the things I tried working with patients that I had this time with. My feeling has always been that the medical system should be much more focused on preventative. And so I used to spend time with the patients on, you've got this going on with your body right now, but what could you do that could make that better? What could you do that would take away some of those symptoms? And that's really, I spend a lot of time doing that, because to me, if you can stop something from starting, then you've got a whole lot further down the road than if you try to fix something that got broken. And the heart of R.E.S.T, right? Yeah, there you go. It is the heart of R.E.S.T, is prevention. And if you find yourself in critical condition, emotionally, spiritually, or physically, we do invite you to step into R.E.S.T.
And there's something that's causing that.
There is a cause,
if you're in dis-ease, we call it disease, but it's dis-ease, then there's something that took you out of ease. There's something that's taking place that is confusing or chaotic. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
We have so many people that want to gift healing to their friends and family members. Due to popular request, we've officially created the Gift of R.E.S.T package for purchase. Please go to theplaceofrest.com/wholeness packages to view the Gift of R.E.S.T. If you've been listening to our podcast regularly and are now wondering, what's next, or how can I get more support? Our Day of Rest course is available to support you in your pilgrimage. Use the promo code PODCAST, all lowercase, to receive a 10% discount for our introductory Day of Rest course. Now back to the show.
Okay, so you're there hours. You begin to invest more and more in developing, really being a liaison between the doctors
Absolutely,
and the patients. Yeah. And beyond being a liaison, I think you did an adequate job of explaining the weight of what many practitioners, RNs, and a myriad of people in the medical field are experiencing. And that's that tension between the regulations, and the legislation of how these institutions are operating, and the compassion and the care that we feel for the families and the patients and all that, and becoming advocates. But in the midst of that, there's a measure of space there for creative thought, and there's space to develop relationships, apply resources that perhaps doctors, they're confined as well, and other practitioners are limited as well. But in your situation, you had a platform, the resources of time and creativity to do a lot of things. When you're sitting in a room with somebody for 3.5 hours, you can bring a book, I suppose, or get on your phone.
I read a lot of books in the process too.
But you chose to do some amazing things. And I want to read a quote before you tell this part of the story, because it's phenomenal. And it's from one of my favorite scientists, physicist. He said, I'm enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination, because my imagination is more important than knowledge. And he never lost sight of that. Knowledge at the end of the day is limited, but imagination, it will eclipse the world. And the story of where you ended up from a very technical, where life and death, everything hinges on your capacity to be on your feet and alert and pay attention to things. And how that really gave birth to this creativity and imagination, and some amazing things developed of that. I have the opposite story as you. So share where this led you.
Yeah, my background is Celtic, Welsh, Irish, and I've always loved Celtic music, and the harp has always been part of that. So when I was 45 years old, I decided I would see if I could play a harp. So
while you were reading some of those books in the clinic? Yeah.
So I was created musically. I've always been able to pick up an instrument and figure something out, but had never really applied it very seriously.
Why?
It just, there were reasons for it, I think. And we might go into that in my life history somewhere along the way, but
I think that's important, because it goes back to the importance of history and our own struggles and the things we wrestle with. And we were talking about that as it pertained to the patients.
Yeah.
But this is a good time to interject why
I'm going to go back to 7 years old.
Well, you know what? You don't have to elaborate, but at least touch on it, because that is the point of why people get sick.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. Yeah. You're disgruntled with your work.
Yeah.
You're really seeing the decline of standard of care.
Right.
You're seeing the frustration of people. You're seeing that everything that took you into the field is diminishing. So what are you doing? What we all do. Try to fill the time with something that will help it pass faster.
Right, yeah.
So you
get through it.
And get through it.
Yeah.
But that quiet, still voice of these early childhood nudges.
Else,
yeah. So you have a love for music. You're musical, yet something kept you away from music all those years.
And what kept me away, when I was 7 to 10, I was taking piano lessons. And when you do that, you have to do recitals. And when I would do a recital, I would screw up on the music, and then I would just walk off the stage. And later in life, actually just before I built my harp, it was revealed to me that I was a perfectionist. I didn't want to let people hear me make a mistake. Mm-hmm. And that goes clear back to my childhood, where my father, I could never do the right thing. And he had a lot of anger issues and things. So that was filtering through all the way through.
And it's interesting because here you have this gift, but you don't want to touch it because of these other experiences. And let people down or be criticized.
Exactly. I was actually helping build a dialysis clinic in China, and the doctors wanted to go out to do karaoke, go out to eat, but karaoke was a part of it. And so when it came time for the Western Americans, I had to get up and do the John Denver, take me home country road. So then Dr. Shi got up and he started singing one of his Chinese selections, and he was terrible. And I'm sitting there looking at this, I'm just like, oh, yeah. But I just had this impression of what do you see up there? And I said, well, it sounds terrible. And the impression came back, well, I didn't say, what did you see? I said, what do you hear? I said, what do you see? I said, well, he's really happy. He's enjoying himself. It's like, I'm not enjoying myself, but he's enjoying himself, And I just had this impression, and I think it's stuck with me from that point on, that it was like a transition moment in my life where I began to realize it wasn't about what other people thought of what I was doing, but what you
were made for, what you were called to. Yeah. The gift. You're not using your gift.
Exactly. I was just really convicted that I wasn't using my gift. And so when I came back to the States, I was coming up to my 45th birthday, and I decided, I want to try this harp thing. And so I got a little kit that made a little 26-string harp. I made it and started plunking around on it. And I tell people within a year I was willing to let somebody hear me. So it still took me a little transition there to let people hear me.
Is this the harp you made?
The one I made, yeah. It was the first one I made. I've made 33 since then.
They're magnificent, by the way. Magnificent.
So after that first year, and I started feeling confident that the music was coming out really pleasant and I enjoyed it, one day I just thought, you know what? I think it would be really beneficial if I just took the harp in and during this 3 hours, during this treatment, just play some music, And that just...
The gift of time.
Yeah.
All of a sudden.
Exactly. But it just took off. People started calling it music therapy, and people started fighting over who was I going to play for.
But there was a reason for that.
Yeah.
Tell us the reason for that.
The reason for that. It started out subtly, but because I was just concentrating on playing the music, but I started noticing that now, when I do a dialysis treatment, the blood pressure will come down because I'm taking fluid off, but was within a certain range. Well, when I was playing the music, it was more drastic, more
severe.
It was much clearer that it was
noticeable,
bringing and then the heart rates would come down, the oxygen saturations would come up. Patients that were getting pain medicine and it wasn't working, all of a sudden it would start working. Within 15 minutes of playing the music, they would start to really settle down. Where they'd been screaming. And a lot of people who never slept started sleeping while I was playing the music. And it was like, there's something physiological going on here that I need to understand. And that's what really started me on this journey. That was around 2006, where I really started paying attention that there was a physiological thing I needed to understand. So.
Wow. Just hearing you tell this story so many times, knowledge is limited, but imagination will eclipse everything.
Yeah.
It has the capacity to displace confusion, chaos, and dis-ease, I think, in all spheres of influence, in all structures of authority, and in all form.
Right.
I think this is a necessary conversation because we associate rest with a state of inactivity.
Right.
In fact, rest
can be very active.
Not only is it active, but it's active in a way that is congruent with laws of nature, things that are self-evident and speak to our natural affections. For example, R.E.S.T is an acronym for relational, emotional, and spiritual truth. And when we go to sleep at night, that has nothing to do with rest.
No.
Rest is a whole different level of sleep.
Right.
And that level of deep rest is when, where, and determines how all these physiological, neurological, biological functions take place. And the entire internal state of a person is reconciled and preparing to do what? Face another day. And reconstructing.
Yeah, we know that the organs, that's when they're repairing, is during our sleeping time. So that's actually, you could say, the body's most active while we're being least active. So it's kind of an interesting paradox.
That's right. Yeah. But rest, when we ask people to step into this place of rest, it's to reconcile relational, emotional, and spiritual.
It's a choice
truth.
And it's intentional.
It's a choice. It's intentional. It can be explained by physics. It can be explained by all the sciences. Mm-hmm. It can be explained, of course, emotionally. But I think it's the physiological function of stepping into that place of rest that we heal.
Yeah.
I always talk about we don't chase a cure in anything. What we always pursue is healing, and reconciling these dynamics is how we heal. I'm so thankful you're here, because in the next segments that follow, you in many ways explain the science of what we do in the most practical way, congruent with laws of nature, explained in music, and it is phenomenal. The results that you experienced at the clinic weren't just with your personal patients, but I know you get letters from all over the world.
I do, yeah.
That people experience a physiological consequence of really the state of rest that the music leads them into. Yeah. Can you talk about that for a little bit before we close this segment?
Yeah. Yes, it's fascinating because even animals are affected by the music. And why not? Because they're physiological beings as much as we are. And one of the things I talk about, the reason why I think that this rest takes place, Emoto, we talked about him earlier. Matsuro Emoto did a whole series of testing on water where he froze samples. And there's a book called The Miracle of Water that he wrote that documents all of this. But he took samples from different sources of water and he froze the samples, and different sources made different styles of crystals. And like you have pure water, it makes that perfect snowflake with the 6 points on it. But different sources would make different. If it had certain minerals in it, it would do one form. And then he took some water out of a sewer and froze it, and it was all deformed. And he played 528 hertz frequency through that water. And I don't remember exactly the time, but it was for a period of time. And then he took that water and froze it again, and the water was perfect. So the 528 hertz, the frequency, did something. It restructured that water so that it made that perfect crystal. Now, if you take the idea, well, what we know scientifically, we are 75 to 80% water, depending on how much we drink every day. And if we have unstructured water, that's going to go to dis-ease. So if we take that 528, and all of the recording I do is 528 hertz frequency, if we take that frequency music and place it through our bodies consistently, that's gonna change things. It's gonna change us from dis-ease into ease. It's gonna restructure our water so that we can be in health. So what I saw, and when I get from people all the time. People tell me, I have had insomnia for years. I started listening. I don't know how I found your music, but I found it, and I started listening, and I'm sleeping all through the night now. Mm-hmm. I've had people tell me they've gotten off drugs by listening to the music. I had one story when this whole started. A woman sent me a letter. I was approached by the nurse educator at one of the hospitals I was doing dialysis in. She said, you're doing this music with the harp, and people are asking me if you have a CD they can take home with them. And I had never even thought of doing a CD, And I said, well, I don't know where I'd start. And she said, well, think about it. And a few days later, a friend of mine said, I know somebody that could do a recording. So we got a CD out called Healing Harp. And I still carry it. A friend of hers had gotten that CD and copied it off and sent her a copy. And within a few days, her husband had a severe heart attack, went to the ER. And the doctor took her aside and said, I would just want you to be prepared. I don't think your husband's going to make it through the night. He said, it's just a really serious, his enzymes are way elevated. A big part of his heart was affected. I don't expect him to make it. I just want you to be prepared. So they finally got him up to the CCU, and while they were putting all the tubes and everything hooked up to the monitors, she asked the nurse, could I bring some music in to play for him? And she said, well, if you put headphones on, that'll be okay, as long as it doesn't bother anybody else. So she brought in a little CD player with my CD on it and some earphones, and she put it on repeat and played that all through the night. The next morning, the doctor walked in, picked up the chart, looked at some numbers, looked up at the monitor, and he goes, What'd you do to this guy? And the nurse, I just followed your orders. He said, this is a different patient than last night. 3 days later, he was home. And so I would never put on my CD, Will Cure, but at the same time,
not without going to jail.
There's prayer, there's hope, there's faith, there's all of these things that enter into the mix. But I think that the 528 frequency was definitely part of it, the music.
Well, after the conversation we had, which we'll delve into in the next segment, we're going to talk about understanding the energy of chaos.
Right.
If a person has a heart attack, there's a lot of things that are in a state of chaos. And the frequency of rest, because that's really what you brought into order.
And
Thank you.
What's amazing to me is I wasn't even there. So I didn't even know the person, but that's how everything
works.
Yeah.
But now with the internet, and this is the beautiful part of social media, internet, Spotify, all these incredible resources we have, because I know now you have millions of followers all over the world. So the healing consequence of this phase of your life's work is unprecedented. Although I will close by saying, I'm not sure you could have accomplished what you did should you not have spent 30 years in the trenches.
Much of our life in what we're not real appreciative of is preparing us for something that is going to take us over the hump. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Amen.
For updates about R.E.S.T and this podcast, please visit our Instagram or Facebook at The Place of R.E.S.T. If you would like more information about Virginia or to support and join the cause of R.E.S.T, please go to theplaceofrest.com/donate or call 949-289-5935. Thank you for listening to R.E.S.T with Virginia Dixon. We'll see you next week.